Jasmine Carter settled into her aisle seat on the packed flight from New York to Los Angeles. She had been looking forward to this trip, a much-needed break after weeks of hard work. She adjusted her headphones, ready to relax, when she noticed a man standing beside her. "Excuse me," the man said, his voice firm. Jasmine looked up to see a tall, middle-aged man with sharp features and an impatient expression. Beside him stood a young boy, no older than 6, clutching a small backpack. "Yes?" Jasmine asked, pulling off her headphones. "I need you to switch seats," the man said, gesturing toward the boy. "My son needs to sit here." Jasmine blinked, confused. "Sorry, but this is my assigned seat." The man sighed in frustration. "Look, my kid prefers the aisle. It makes things easier for me. Can you just move?" Jasmine glanced at the child, who looked unsure, then back at the man. "Sir, I understand, but I chose this seat for a reason. I'd like to keep it." His face tightened. "Come on. Be reasonable. It's just a seat." Jasmine felt her stomach twist. She had seen this type of entitlement before, people expecting her to comply simply because they felt their needs were more important. Before she could respond, another voice interrupted. "Is there a problem here?" Jasmine turned to see a flight attendant, a tall woman with a composed expression. The man's demeanor shifted, but he quickly regained his confidence. "This lady is refusing to move so my son can have her seat," he said, exasperated. The flight attendant's eyes flicked to Jasmine, then back to the man. "She doesn't have to move, sir. That's her assigned seat." Jasmine felt a small sense of relief, but she had a feeling this wasn't over yet. The man's jaw tightened at the flight attendant's response. He let out an irritated sigh and folded his arms. "Look, I'm just asking for a little courtesy here," he said, his voice dripping with condescension. "She can move to another seat. It's not that big of a deal." Jasmine inhaled deeply, keeping her composure. "Sir, I booked this seat in advance because I prefer the aisle. I have no obligation to move." The flight attendant, whose name tag read Emily, stepped forward slightly, placing herself between Jasmine and the man. "Sir, as I said, she has the right to stay in her assigned seat. If you'd like, I can check if there's another aisle seat available for you or your son." The man scoffed, shaking his head. "Why should I have to move? My child," he gestured toward his son, who now looked uncomfortable, "needs this seat more than she does." Jasmine felt her patience wearing thin. She turned to the boy, offering a gentle smile. "I'm sure your son is perfectly fine sitting where his ticket assigned him. It's a lesson in following the rules, right?" The man's eyes darkened, his face turning red. "Are you serious right now?" he snapped. This is exactly why. He stopped himself, but Jasmine could hear the unsaid words in the way his mouth twisted. Emily's expression hardened. "Sir, I need you to lower your voice and return to your seat. You're making a scene." A few passengers nearby were already watching, some whispering to each other. Jasmine could feel the tension thickening around her, but she remained calm. The man clenched his fists and muttered, "Unbelievable," before turning on his heel and stomping down the aisle. Jasmine exhaled, but something told her this wasn't the last she'd hear from him. As the man stomped away, Jasmine took a deep breath, trying to shake off the tension. She wasn't new to moments like this, where entitlement clashed with dignity, but that didn't make it any less exhausting. Emily, the flight attendant, leaned in slightly. "I'm really sorry about that. Some people just don't understand boundaries." Jasmine nodded, offering a small smile. "I appreciate you standing up for me. Not everyone does." Emily gave her an understanding look before heading toward the front of the plane. Meanwhile, the murmurs around them had settled, but Jasmine could still feel a few pairs of eyes lingering down a few rows ahead. The man sat down beside his son, his lips moving in a hushed but furious whisper. The boy looked down at his hands, shifting uncomfortably. Jasmine felt a pang of sympathy for him. It wasn't his fault his father was like this. Just as she started to relax, she noticed the man flagging down another flight attendant. This one, a tall man with graying hair, approached and listened as the father began complaining, gesturing toward Jasmine. Jasmine sighed. Here we go again, Emily quickly returned, her expression firm. Ma'am, I want you to know that you have nothing to worry about. You're not moving. If he keeps pushing, we'll handle it. Jasmine smiled. Thank you. I just hope this doesn't get out of hand. Emily pursed her lips. Let's just say I have a feeling this isn't over. And sure enough, within minutes, the father raised his voice again, loud enough for half the cabin to hear. This is ridiculous. I demand to speak to the head flight attendant. This woman is being unreasonable. Gasps rippled through the rows, and Jasmine felt her stomach tighten. Here we go. The murmurs in the cabin grew louder as the father's voice carried across the rows. Passengers exchanged glances, some shaking their heads, while others pulled out their phones, sensing that things were escalating. Jasmine took a steadying breath, gripping the armrests of her seat. She had been through enough situations like this to know that staying calm was the best response, but that didn't mean it was easy. Emily, still standing nearby, tightened her jaw. She turned and walked briskly toward the front of the plane. Moments later, a poised woman in a navy blue uniform appeared. Her name tag read Linda, head flight attendant. She had an air of authority, her expression unreadable as she approached. Sir, I understand there's a concern, Linda said, her voice professional but firm. The father crossed his arms, looking indignant. Yes. I paid for extra comfort so my son could sit in peace, and this woman is refusing to move. It's common courtesy. Linda's expression didn't waver. Sir, you purchased one seat. This lady purchased her seat as well. She has every right to stay where she is. The father scoffed, waving his hand. Oh, come on. I'm asking for a simple accommodation. A young child should take priority over me? Jasmine interjected, her tone calm but unwavering. Because I don't look like someone who deserves to be comfortable? The father's face flushed, but before he could reply, Linda spoke again. Sir, let me be clear, passengers are not required to switch seats unless they personally choose to. She is staying right where she is. And if you continue to create a disturbance, I will have no choice but to escalate this matter to the captain. A ripple of satisfaction spread among the nearby passengers. Some even nodded in approval. The father's mouth opened as if he wanted to argue, but something about Linda's authoritative stance made him pause. He exhaled sharply and slumped back in his seat, shaking his head. Jasmine could still feel his anger radiating, but at least, for now, it seemed like the situation had been contained, or so she thought, because just as Linda turned to walk away, the father muttered under his breath, just loud enough for Jasmine to hear, "This is why people like her don't belong in first class." Jasmine's fingers clenched into fists. This wasn't over. Not by a long shot. Jasmine felt her pulse quicken at the man's muttered words. The insult hung in the air like a dark cloud, heavy and undeniable. She had dealt with subtle prejudice before, but something about this moment, about his audacity, made her blood simmer. Before she could react, a young woman seated across the aisle turned her head sharply. She had short blonde hair and a piercing gaze that landed squarely on the father. "Excuse me," she said, loud enough for those around to hear. "Did you really just say that?" The father stiffened, clearly not expecting to be called out. "I didn't say anything," he muttered, suddenly interested in the in-flight magazine, but it was too late. Other passengers had noticed the exchange. A man in business attire raised an eyebrow. An older woman shook her head disapprovingly. Jasmine took a deep breath, then turned to look at the father. Her voice was measured but firm. "You can say whatever you want under your breath, but I promise you, people like me belong wherever we choose to be. Including first class." A few passengers murmured in agreement. The father let out an exasperated sigh, clearly feeling the weight of the stares around him. His son, still oblivious to the tension, played with his seatbelt. At that moment, Linda, the head flight attendant, reappeared. But this time, she wasn't alone. Behind her stood a tall man in a pilot's uniform, the captain of the flight. The father's face paled slightly. "Sir," Linda said, her voice still composed but with an unmistakable edge of authority. "Captain Reynolds would like to have a word with you." Passengers straightened in their seats, sensing that something significant was about to happen. Jasmine folded her arms and watched as the father shifted uncomfortably. This time, he wasn't in control of the situation, and he knew it. The entire cabin seemed to hold its breath as Captain Reynolds stepped forward, his expression unreadable. His uniform was crisp, his presence commanding. He folded his hands in front of him, looking down at the father with a calm yet firm demeanor. "Sir," the captain began, his voice steady but with an unmistakable authority. "We need to have a conversation about your behavior on this flight." The father shifted uncomfortably. "I don't know what this is about," he said, feigning ignorance. Linda, the flight attendant, arched an eyebrow. "Oh, I think you do," she replied. "You've been making inappropriate comments and attempting to pressure another passenger out of her assigned seat. That's unacceptable." Passengers murmured in agreement. Some even nodded, clearly relieved that the situation was finally being addressed. The father scoffed. "I was just asking for a little kindness, that's all." "My son," Captain Reynolds held up a hand, cutting him off. "This isn't about your son," he said firmly. "This is about you and how you're treating another passenger." The father opened his mouth to argue, but the weight of the captain's gaze silenced him. "Now," Captain Reynolds continued, "we have a choice. Either you can apologize to Miss Jasmine," she supplied. "Miss Jasmine," the captain said, "or we will have to consider other actions, including notifying authorities upon landing." Jasmine's eyes widened slightly. She hadn't expected this level of intervention, but she wasn't complaining. The father, however, looked stunned. "You're threatening me?" he asked incredulously. The captain's expression didn't change. "I'm giving you an opportunity to make this right. It's your decision." The father clenched his jaw. He looked around, realizing there was no support for him. No one was on his side. Even the other parents seated nearby refused to meet his gaze. Then, after a long pause, he exhaled sharply and turned to Jasmine. "Fine," he muttered. "I'm sorry." But the words were empty. Jasmine could hear the resentment in them, the bitterness. The captain tilted his head. "Try again," he said. A flicker of something, maybe embarrassment, maybe anger, crossed the father's face. But this time, when he spoke, his voice was quieter. "I'm sorry," he said again. Jasmine met his gaze and nodded. She knew he didn't mean it, but that wasn't her problem. Captain Reynolds, satisfied, stepped back. "Good. Now let's continue this flight peacefully." Linda gave Jasmine a small, approving smile before walking away. As the tension in the cabin slowly eased, Jasmine took a deep breath and looked out the window. For the first time since boarding, she felt like she truly belonged. As the flight resumed its normal rhythm, Jasmine could still feel the tension lingering in the air. The father had begrudgingly apologized, but the way he clenched his fists and stared out the window told her everything. He wasn't sorry. He was humiliated. She exhaled and tried to relax, but a voice beside her pulled her attention back. "That was impressive," an older woman in the row across from her said. She had kind eyes, her silver hair tucked neatly behind her ears. "You handled yourself with grace, dear." Jasmine smiled, appreciating the support. "Thank you. I didn't expect it to escalate like that." The woman nodded knowingly. "Men like him, they think the world bends for them. And when it doesn't, they lash out." Jasmine glanced toward the father, who was now quietly murmuring to his son. The little boy seemed unaware of the weight of what had just happened. He just wanted to watch his cartoons. "Why do people act like this?" Jasmine asked, more to herself than anyone else. The older woman sighed. "It's about control, sweetheart. Some people can't stand the idea that the world doesn't revolve around them. But today, you showed him otherwise." Jasmine was about to respond when Linda, the flight attendant, reappeared. "Miss Jasmine," she said with a small smile. "The captain wanted me to check in on you. Are you doing okay?" Jasmine hesitated, then nodded. "I think so. Just, still a little on edge." Linda leaned in slightly and whispered, "You should know something. The captain and I talked before I came over here." Jasmine furrowed her brows. "About what?" Linda glanced around, making sure no one else was listening. This isn't the first time we've had complaints about that man. Jasmine blinked. What? Linda nodded. He's been on our radar. Different flights, different complaints. But this is the first time someone has actually stood up to him publicly. Jasmine's heart pounded. What happens now? Linda gave her a knowing look. Let's just say, next time he tries to board a flight with us, he might find things a little more difficult. Jasmine wasn't sure whether to feel relieved or unnerved. But one thing was clear, this incident wasn't over yet. Jasmine sat in stunned silence, absorbing Linda's words. The idea that this man had a history of complaints didn't surprise her, but it did make her wonder, why hadn't anything been done before? She glanced over at the father. He was scrolling through his phone, seemingly unbothered. But Linda's revelation changed everything. Are you saying he might be banned from flying? Jasmine asked in a hushed tone. Linda hesitated before replying. It's possible. We have protocols for disruptive passengers, and repeated complaints put someone on a no-fly watch list. But it's not just about what happened today. Airlines take patterns of behavior seriously, especially when passengers make others feel unsafe. Jasmine swallowed. She hadn't expected to set off a chain reaction like this. Do I need to do anything? She asked. Linda shook her head. No. Your actions spoke for themselves. But if corporate asks for a statement, it's up to you whether you want to give one. Jasmine nodded slowly. She wasn't sure how she felt about this. She had stood up for herself, yes, but had she just ruined this man's ability to travel? Did he deserve that? Before she could dwell on it, a voice interrupted. Excuse me, miss. Jasmine turned to see the little boy standing beside her row. He looked nervous, clutching the stuffed animal he had been playing with earlier. I'm sorry my dad was mean, he said softly. Jasmine's chest tightened. She hadn't expected an apology from him, especially not like this. She smiled gently. It's not your fault, sweetheart. The boy hesitated before nodding. Then, as quickly as he had appeared, he turned and hurried back to his seat. Jasmine exhaled, watching as he climbed onto his chair. The father barely seemed to notice. Linda, who had witnessed the exchange, gave Jasmine a sad smile. Kids see more than we think. Jasmine nodded, her heart aching a little. She had stood up for herself today. But she couldn't help but wonder, was this boy doomed to follow in his father's footsteps, or would he grow up to be different? One thing was certain, this flight had changed things for all of them. As the flight continued, Jasmine found herself lost in thought. The little boy's quiet apology had shaken her more than she expected. It wasn't his fault that his father had treated her so poorly, and yet, he seemed to understand that something wasn't right. Meanwhile, the father, oblivious to everything happening around him, seemed to be deep in a text conversation on his phone. Every few minutes, he glanced around with an irritated expression, as if waiting for someone to back him up. But the flight attendants had made their stance clear. He was in the wrong. Jasmine noticed other passengers stealing glances at him, some whispering among themselves. The situation had drawn attention, and it was clear that many were not on his side. Then, Linda returned, this time with another flight attendant, a tall, serious-looking man with a badge clipped to his uniform that read Senior Flight Supervisor, Mark Hudson. Sir, Mark said firmly, stopping by the man's seat. We need to have a word. The father frowned. About what? Mark crossed his arms. About your behavior on this flight. The father scoffed. Oh, come on. Are you seriously still on about that? I just asked her to move. Mark's expression didn't change. You didn't just ask. You pressured, belittled, and caused a disruption. Some people think they can do whatever they want, but not today. Jasmine smiled softly. I appreciate you standing up for me. That doesn't always happen. Linda shook her head. It should. And it will. More and more people are starting to push back against this kind of behavior. As the flight neared its destination, the captain's voice came over the intercom, announcing the descent. Passengers began adjusting their seats and gathering their belongings. The father stayed quiet, but his son suddenly leaned forward. Miss? The boy said hesitantly. Jasmine turned to him, her expression softening. Yes? He hesitated, glancing at his father before lowering his voice. I think you were right to stay in your seat. Jasmine felt a lump form in her throat. The father turned sharply to his son. What are you talking about? The boy flinched but looked determined. It wasn't fair to ask her to move just because we wanted the seats. She got here first. For a moment, silence stretched between them. The father's face turned red, not just from anger, but perhaps embarrassment. He looked around, noticing the stares from nearby passengers. The weight of judgment was pressing down on him. Jasmine smiled gently at the boy. That means a lot. Thank you. Before the father could say anything, Linda returned with a final note. Sir, she said, holding a piece of paper. This is for you. What is it? The father grumbled, snatching it. His eyes scanned the paper before his face paled. It's an official report of the incident, Linda explained. It will be reviewed by our airline. If necessary, further action may be taken. The father looked like he wanted to argue, but instead, he gritted his teeth and shoved the paper into his pocket. As the plane landed and passengers disembarked, Jasmine grabbed her bag and walked down the aisle, her head held high. She had stood her ground, and most importantly, she had planted a seed in that young boy's mind, a seed of fairness, respect, and change. The world might not change overnight, Jasmine thought as she stepped off the plane. But change starts with moments like this. If this story moved you, don't forget to like, share, and comment your thoughts below. Please subscribe.